I've tried to add more wrist hinge. I've done so in such a disastrous way that I've got no chance of controlling this club face. So being able to see those numbers and measure that is invaluable. There's nothing else that can show you that on the market that compares to how Hack Motion shows you what's going on at the wrist level. Being able to set the parameters down here at this checkpoint and then take that to the top is going to really help you to train good wrist hinge, the correct wrist hinge, which will lead to better golf. And a great benefit of the Hack Motion wrist sensor is being able to set the parameters for where you want the wrists to be. Achieving the correct wrist hinge in the golf swing can seem like searching for that elusive needle in a haystack for many of you. It may look like you can do whatever you want with the wrist because there's lots of different looking golf swings out there. But the truth is, if you really want to master the contact, club face control, and improve your ball striking, getting the wrists right in the golf swing is absolutely essential. In this video today, I'm going to specifically discuss the proper wrist hinge in the backswing and how you can build that into your swing very quickly using a drill that's very straightforward, but like most good drills, very effective. I want to use the Hack Motion wrist sensor to help you see some of these movements of the wrists and understand where they take place, where you're getting it wrong, and how we can overcome that. When we start at setup, I want you to take a look at how my wrist is conditioned.
Sometimes I really wish. Problem is, I don't think the resolution is right. Okay, I think that's it. Let's go get her done. Here we go. Here we go. Yeah. Go.
is set up, I have a very small amount of lead wrist extension. Extension is the cupping or the movement of the wrist in this direction, where I get this angle in the back of my wrist. I have a small amount of extension in my lead wrist because of how I grip the club. That's pretty normal. That's quite standard if you have a fairly neutral grip. So that extension number sits around 13 degrees. And then in terms of the up and down movement of the wrist, upwards is called radial deviation, and the downward movement of the wrist is called ulnar deviation. When I set up to the ball, I have around 27, 28 degrees of ulnar deviation. Again, pretty standard. But that's not how my wrists are going to stay throughout the swing. If they did, I'd have almost no ability to create power. So we have to move our wrists in the swing to create speed, otherwise you just can't hit the ball far enough. But how you hinge and bend your wrists matters. Most of you are doing it wrong. It's costing you control, it's costing you distance, and it's costing you shots every time you play. Let's take a look at the difference in the wrist between setup and the top of the swing. I've already discussed how I've got this ulnar deviation. So that's this 28 degrees of, if you like, oh, that would be ridiculous. So I've got a maximum swing length about this far back. So we know that I need to start adding some radial. I've got to start hinging my wrist, as I said, to create power. But it's important I do it in a very specific way. Equally with this extension of my lead wrist and setup, as I swing to the top, I don't keep that extension. That extension's disappeared. I now have a very flat lead wrist where that number is slightly flexed and you've even started to swing the club back. So if I go ahead and take this club to the top, let's check out those numbers a couple more times. The 6 degrees of flexion basically means my wrist is pretty flat. That's a good thing. And I've got 14, 15 degrees of radial deviation. That's this upward cocking. That's what most of you would understand as wrist hinge. The cocking of the wrist, the upward movement. So that was 6 degrees of flexion and 15 degrees of radial deviation. Let me now go to this preset position in the backswing. Okay, I'm going to set up with the shaft parallel to the ground and pointing more or less down my stance line or down my target line. If we look at the screen there, you'll see I've got 15 degrees of radial deviation. That was the same amount I'm going to have at the top. There you see that's 15 or 16, that's perfect. So the amount of radial deviation that I need, the amount of wrist hinge that I need, has already been built in to this particular drill. I've put it all in here at the setup. Equally, the flexion extension component, this is reading 0 degrees of extension. That means I can get the sense of building in the correct wrist movement just in this first piece of the swing, get my arms and wrists organized in such a way that from here, all I need to do is turn my shoulder down under my chin, and I've completed the perfect backswing. So from the front view, just to demonstrate, I'm hinging the wrists. That's a broad term, as we know. Hinging the wrists can mean lots of different things, but for many of you it will be chaotic. You won't know what you're doing. This is specific. You're taking the wrists to the point where the shaft's parallel to the ground. The butt end of the club effectively still sits over the ball. If I put a ball in place here in front of me, I'm not moving the arm and the club away. Okay, I'm just setting the wrist where the butt end of the club still sits more or less on top of the golf ball. That's where I want it to be. Shaft, as I said, is parallel to the ground. And in terms of those wrist numbers, again, look, 4 degrees of flexion in the lead wrist. It's pretty much flat. And I've got 18 degrees of radial. Those numbers have hovered around that same window consistently. This wrist and arm structure that I'm building in here is the same wrist and arm structure that I want to have at the top. There's 2 degrees of extension and there's still 18 degrees of radial deviation. That's sufficient hinge to hit the ball far and to control your direction. So many of you get this wrong when you misinterpret wrist hinge. You get the radial or the cocking part of the wrist completely wrong, and that throws out the rest of the wrist angles, which ultimately loses radial. Okay, I've gone from that 15, 16, 17, 18 degrees of radial deviation. Now that says 27, 28, 29. I can even take it further than that. I've added wrist cock, no doubt. Take a look at that extension number. Have a look at the extension at the top of the swing. 37 degrees of lead wrist extension is directly responsible for spinning this club face open and into a wildly uncontrollable position. Once you do that, all bets are off. You may hit a good shot, 1 in 10, 1 in 20, but that will be the anomaly. That will be the rare one. From that poor wrist position at the top, where I've tried to extend my swing, I've tried to add more wrist hinge, a good wrist hinge, the correct wrist hinge, which will lead to better golf. And a great benefit of the Hack Motion wrist sensor is being able to set the parameters for where you want the wrists to be. And this particular drill is a great example of how that can really help, because what we want to be able to do is to set the wrists for the drill correctly. You're going to get some sound here. You'll hear when my wrists
I'm at the point of my golf
hit this
career, I
ideal
realized
spot.
I'm never going
So I
to
can
get
set the range to
just,
where I need that extension and flexion or ulnar and radial to be, and I can get some feedback. I can also get some feedback, which is the sense of vibration. So I also get the feeling on my wrist. So I get some feedback, which is not just the auditory feedback, but also I get a sense on my wrist of the sense of vibrating. And that's great if you don't want that loud noise playing when you're practicing at the driving range. But I'm going to use it for the purpose of this video so that you can see and hear when I'm in range. So I'm moving that wrist back. There's that little bit of flexion and that radial, that hinge, to a point where I'm comfortable with it. I've already explained how too much is bad. If I was to take this back and over hinge my wrist at this point, you hear how the noise has disappeared. That's too much wrist hinge. Equally, if I took it back with no wrist hinge, I'd get no feedback because this is incorrect, or the feedback I'd be getting would be, okay, no sound, this isn't where I need to be. So preset the wrist, and then can I keep it at the top? You heard that where I set it, and then take it to the top. Not quite in range there, just a looking point, there it is. Keep it, there we go. That was slower. It was a little bit more under control there, just beginning to get a sense of how those wrists feel as I continue to load in the backswing, and even as I start to come down in the downswing. So you can do slow swings, dry drills, just taking yourself through the paces, setting the wrist, trying to keep it in range as I go back. Here we go. Coming down. That's going to be really good. Look how the wrists are still cocked. I've still got sufficient lag to be able to then deliver this club at impact. So helping you to see that the wrist movements in this middle part of the swing, the backswing and the downswing, are quite similar. You can set the range to help you train that. Then, of course, you can go ahead and hit shots. You get feedback from the app as far as how you move your wrist. I can set my wrists. I can go to the top. I can just do this exercise. And I can go ahead and hit balls, trying to keep that sensation. There we go. I'm going to hit from here. That's felt pretty good. Nice little draw. I'll take the wrist out of position so it's not making too much noise. And I can get the feedback there on how my wrists move, both in terms of the up and down nature of the radial and ulnar, and in terms of the flexion extension of this lead wrist. So there's some ways to understand the proper wrist hinge in the golf swing. Of course, if you don't have access to Hack Motion, that's fine. You can still utilize this drill. The position of the hands at the point in the swing here, where the shaft is parallel to the ground. Okay, keeping those wrists in that condition. You can hear that's in the perfect spot. It's very different to where I am at setup.
I mean,
I'm going to move the wrist.
Everybody says don't do that. But, how to get there? I have to fucking rip it inside.
And the trail wrist is bent back slightly. I'm adding this radial, this upward hinge. As I'm hinging upwards, I'm also flexing the wrist. There's my checkpoint, all the way to the top. and through. Train like that and you'll be training for the perfect wrist hinge mechanics. I hope you found the information in that video useful, with a drill that you can take to the range or even use at home, just doing dry exercises, practicing that preset position and then taking the club to the top. Whatever you found from today's video, it's essential to understand that club face control really is wrist control. And if you want to improve your wrist mechanics, you should check out the link down in the description for more videos that will help you to train your wrists. How the wrists work throughout the golf swing truly is the foundation of both power production and club face control. In this video, I'll share with you the role of the wrists and how that newfound information can help you to unlock better ball striking, greater accuracy, and increased distance. Let's start by explaining the range of motion of the wrists and how you can define them. It's a complex joint, one which has lots of movement and potential ranges of motion. We're going to explain how the wrists work in 3 planes of motion. First of all, we have the up and down nature of the wrist cock or the wrist hinge. This would be the wrists working in this vertical fashion, up and down. When you cock the wrists upwards or hinge them upwards, this is referred to as radial deviation, where you're hinging the wrists upwards. And that movement in the wrist would typically be associated with some power production, but at the same time, it's also associated with keeping the club face a little bit more open and would be associated with hitting higher shots. If you went the opposite way and uncocked the wrists, so move the wrists in a downward fashion, where the wrist is arched at the top here and the fingers are pointing more down towards the ground, that's ulnar deviation. And the downward cocking of the wrists, like so, would be associated with hitting the ball lower and closing the club face. The next piece to speak about would be the rotation of the wrists and how the turning and twisting of the shaft of the wrists and the forearms both controls the club face and the directional pattern of your shots, as well as the power production in terms of delaying this release and then firing that power into the ball. The movements can be described as supination of the forearms or pronation of the forearms. The easiest way to remember this is that supination would be when you're holding a bowl of soup in your hands. That would be the upward description, and then turned down would be pronation. And in golf, the lead arm and the trail arm work in opposites. So when one arm is pronating, the other arm is supinating. That would be the backswing movement. And then in the downswing and the follow through, the lead arm would start to supinate all the way into the follow through, and the trail arm would pronate. You just need to know that those motions happen, and from a directional control point of view, you can use this information to understand whether you need to add more pronation or take some away. And then finally, the flexion and extension of the wrists, the twisting of the wrists in this horizontal plane, where the hand would turn inwards like so, would be described as flexion of the wrists, where they're bowed, and the opposite would be where the hands and the fingers are pointing away from me, and I have this angle in the back of my wrist, this cupping. That's the extension of the wrists. And once again, in golf, they work opposite to each other. They work in these pairs where one wrist is flexing, the other one is extending, and vice versa. How that affects your golf club would be to say that if I took this club here in its standard condition with a square face, and I moved this lead wrist into the most amount of flexion, twisting it so now it's bowed and in a more flexed place, you'll see what that's done to the club face. Notice how the club face now is not pointing straight up and down. The bottom edge of the club here, the leading edge, goes from this vertical condition into this turned or twisted one where it's very close. So flexion of the lead wrist would be associated with more of a closing of the club face. Equally, if I flip that on its head and took the same neutral setup and turned my lead wrist into the most amount of extension, so I added more angle here, so there's a maximum angle between the forearm and the back of the hands, cupping or extension as it's described, has now opened the club face. Swinging back, that club face would look very, very different is down the line camera view. So now you're more familiar with the way that the wrists move throughout the swing. We should hit some shots and try to show you the differences in some of those movements. It's worth noting at this point, there's no perfect way to move the wrists. Every golfer has a slightly different and individual. What you're doing, those of you struggling to control direction and losing power, you're twisting this club incorrectly. So this is a case of educating yourself on how the wrists move, using the hack motion to measure what's going on at the wrist level, and to be able to get real-time data as to how you're moving these wrists. If we take a look at the avatar now, you'll just see that we've got the twisting piece of the wrist there. I've got the extension and flexion, and I've got the up, the ulnar, and the radial. The radial is up. You can see that's moving up to 17 degrees, and then down into ulnar, 28 degrees. So the flexion, extension, the radial, ulnar, and we've got this rotational component as well. Solid little shot there, just drew it slightly to the left, very, very slightly to the left of the target. I'm hitting an 8-iron here. You'll see, looking at the numbers there, you'll see how you get the feedback on address, top of the swing and impact for the flexion, the ulnar radial, and the rotation. And I think that's really interesting to look at the pattern of good players from a flexion and extension point of view would be that golfers start is I've twisted my wrist very slightly into this flat or slightly flexed condition. So at the top, my left wrist and my forearm are more or less in a flat condition, exposed in theory, and that allows me to keep the shaft more forward when I hit the ball, which we know is desirable for good ball striking, solid contact and good distance. So I'm able to keep the shaft moving forwards at impact because of the added flexion I've put into this lead. This is a common pattern of high handicap golfers who don't hit the ball very far and who typically slice the ball to the right for right-handed golfers. This pattern of wrist movement is usually associated with how there's 58 degrees of extension. That's an enormous difference in terms of the angle of my wrist and the angle of my club face at the top of the swing. And it feels to me like a very weak position, but for many of you who've got used to swinging your wrists and twisting your wrists like this will feel very powerful. You'll feel like this is where you're getting your power from, but it's this misguided feel because it's not producing the reel that you want. I can go from the top here into that extended condition with 33 degrees of radial deviation. That's the upward hinging of the wrist that we spoke about. That upward hinging of the wrist is necessary for producing power. But if you're not careful, as you move your wrist up, you'll combine it with twisting the lead wrist into extension, which opens the club face, and that's what's getting you into trouble. You can go back, you can keep this wrist flat. You can see there it's 4 degrees, there we go, 5 degrees of flexion, 3 degrees of flexion, 22 degrees of radial deviation. I'm still adding the radial, I'm still adding the wrist hinge. You'll see there on the screen how that ball started to the right, curved more to the right, went 106 yards compared to 150 something on my first shot. That's an enormous difference in terms of potential power. This is an 8-iron. And you'll see here, looking at the screen, I started in basically the same amount of extension at setup. So my grip was the same. I didn't make any changes there. It was 11 degrees of extension as opposed to 9 degrees, so effectively the same. But at the top of the swing, I was in 38 degrees of extension. If you remember the shot before, my standard shot, if it's completely out of position as it was in that demonstration of mine, I'm going to be trying to subconsciously fix that in that very last part of the swing. And it's interesting because that's exactly what you're doing with your poor club face control. And you're making it much more likely that you hit the ground before the ball. Fat, thin shots would be typical.
So it's like, okay, that feels great. If you could just sit here and do this all day long, damn, how do you get from here to there? Man, it's like you got a rip it inside. It really fucking is. I'm about as uncomfortable swinging the golf club as I am. Man, I just can't fucking figure this shit out. 51 years old, still just fucking fighting golf clubs. Just want to swing it here, you know, just like I said, this feels awesome. I could do this. too when I get uncomfortable. I swing out my fucking shoes. My driver like just fucking let it rip. Can't take a chance. couldn't square it up no better. There you go, gang. Get me on in there. Get me on here where I'm just dead. I couldn't. I mean, give me 500 buckets of balls and say, hit that tree dead straight. Wow, gang. Wow, wow. This is horseshit. And you gonna go back and make fucking 100 yards? I mean, god damn, bro. I don't even know why you made me go. I mean, first of all, it should be out of bounds where it was. Fuck this goddamn game. I'm gonna fucking hit the goddamn tree dead square. Dead square. And the top of a tree is gonna throw it fucking 100 yards the other way. What was that? Is something in the middle of the fairway now? Damn, man, it's a fucking 60 degrees wide open. And it's uphill lie, and you're just gonna roll out like a fucking chip in a goddamn fucking weird seminar. You already got me. You ain't gotta get me no more, okay? I've gotten got. Man. Top of the fucking tree aren't hard as the bottom of the trees. Like, no trees in my way. I could just get some loft on a fucking drive. Uh, 173 balls. I do that with a driver. It's like I can't. smothered, and covered. Scattered, smothered, and covered. However, shots. That's all it says I do. Okay, yes, gang, you're right. Fucking hit that really good. You're right. Right. This is what I just a while ago. Either I can't, I'm either too short or I'm too hard. I don't have any in between but these motherfucking things. Scroll out. There you go. Get on out there. Get up there and fucking two and get to the fucking hole. Get up there to two. It's been a bad week. Every round this week's been bad for me. Like I start good and all of a sudden it just like the wheels. Wind's in my back, man. In my face, gang. I mean, it's in my face. My face. Whoa! That's what's up. Yeah. That's about to eat. We're going to get this up a little bit. I think. Romania. Told you, man. I don't have I only have long. And if I don't go long, it's going way short. Only, only have long. I'm going to get a break. I'm going to try to do anything that they do. Right there with the wood chipper. What I just told y'all. Oh my God! What is this guy doing? Here. I'm 70 ball speed. I wish I could just do that. I just don't know. Not a very good round. This driver is really hurting. And got it over with. Hurting.